BCG vaccine, the vaccine for tuberculosis, which has been around for over 100 years, has suddenly seems to have made a comeback in the world of vaccination one more time. It is rather unusual for a vaccine of that vintage to make a comeback 100 years later. It should have been superseded by a whole bunch of other newer, better usually vaccines, but this one has not. So here we are going to talk about what the next 100 year looks like for the BCG vaccine. This bacteria was identified by Robert Koch in the 1880s, but it took several decades before an effective vaccine could be developed. And it was already produced in relatively large quantities in the early 1920s. And in 1931, BCG vaccine was pretty settled all across Europe, except for one problem that I'm going to talk about in a second, that Carl Nesland in 1931 observed one peculiar fact about BCG. He said that the mortality rate that was reduced as a result of the use of the BCG was much more than what he would have expected just from by the decrease in tuberculosis alone. So there was something else going on with the BCG vaccine that was not quite well understood. And he called it a non-specific immunity, which turned out to be pretty prescient about what we're going to see in the future. Now it has become known as the trained immunity of a vaccine. And that has not just applied to this particular vaccine, but also a whole bunch of other things. But this one happens to be the longest running one. Germany was the first place in Germany where they were supposed to start the BCG vaccine in that country. Unfortunately, what became known as Lübecker disaster, because between 1929 and 1933, a whole bunch of kids died right after receiving the vaccine. And it turned out upon investigation that there was an accidental contamination of vaccine, which meant that these kids didn't get the weakened version of the virus. Rather, they got a big virulent virus dose in their body, which actually killed them rather than protecting them from future infection. Now that put a setback during the 1930s on how the vaccine was seen, and in general for all vaccines that were seen in the light of this particular vaccine disaster. And as a result, interest in this particular vaccine waned in all of Europe. However, during the World War II, it became very clear how this particular disease, namely tuberculosis, was actually propagating across Europe, and not just across Europe, but coming back into Europe from Asian countries in big numbers. And that's when there was a resurgence of introducing BCG vaccine one more time, and they were applied to soldiers and later on to children. As the BCG vaccine was being developed, around the same time, there was a move towards getting other kinds of protection through antibiotics. And one of the discoveries made was in 1943 by Selman Waksman. He identified streptomycin along with a whole bunch of other kinds of things that were related to that, for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1952. Around the same time, when India became independent in 1947, immediately a world body was set up which was going to distribute and produce and distribute BCG vaccine in India. Unfortunately, there were a whole bunch of Indian intellectuals who had already followed what had happened in Germany, and they also raised the following point. Why was the vaccine being given to India or producing in India, whereas there's a cure at hand? Shouldn't streptomycin be used rather than trying to vaccinate children, which in their mind were very, very uncertain in their efficacy? And as a result, they accused the West of using India as a test bed which the West could not use in their own countries for. And we see the echo of the same kind of thing coming back in other vaccines, such as recently for COVID vaccine as well. There's quite a bit of interplay going on between COVID and tuberculosis. We see them as two opposing forces. The BCG vaccine increases immunity, and in some ways it actually helps people with COVID to reduce their symptoms and their virulence. Now, there's also another dynamic going on in all of that, and that is, while the BCG vaccine has been used in developing countries for years, the result of COVID, because of restrictions of movement and so on, has reduced the use of the BCG vaccine in developing countries. One example is Brazil, where around 79% of the children of the right age were given the BCG vaccine in 2021. It went up marginally in 2022 to 82%, but contrast that with what happened for it a decade ago. Children of that age were getting vaccinated 100% of the time. So there has been a substantial disruption of the use of the BCG vaccine in developing countries. There's also another subtle thing at play, namely the fact that there has been so much controversy about the COVID vaccine itself that has made people reluctant to take other kinds of vaccination, in particular the BCG vaccine, which is very unfortunate. How much did COVID interrupt in the business of TB reporting? That we can see very clearly in India. For example, here's a chart for TB notification to the authorities in India during 2019, 2020, and 2021. Recall that 2020 and 2021, in the early parts, were very big in terms of COVID infection across India, whereas 2019 it was not. And you can see there has been a huge decline in notification for TB, especially in the months of April and May, both in 2020 and 2021 in India compared with what happened in 2019. As a result, there has been a tremendous disruption of the progress that India was making in terms of TB. Less reporting of a disease, you might think that's good news. In this case, it's not. We saw in the previous slide that the reporting of TB in India went down as a result of COVID. And in this picture, we see what happened as a consequence for 2020, the mortality rate per 100,000 in India went up as a result of this interruption by COVID for TB. 2015, the World Health Organization set up an ambitious plan called End TB by 2035. Now, if the level was 100 in 2015 and the rate went down at the same rate as the previous decade up to 2015, then it would not have much dent in the incidence of TB in the world as is seen by the red line. So from 100 it would have gone down to about 70. With a harder approach, they were planning to scale it up so that there could be two possible paths. One is to reduce it all the way down to 25% of what it was in 2015 by 2035, or in the case of an aggressive approach, even more aggressive approach, they could reduce it down to 0. However, as a result of COVID, all of that went out the window. People do not recognize that while BCG itself is good for TB, especially if it is given at an early age, it is also good for all kinds of other things. For example, most people don't recognize that the standard treatment for bladder cancer today is BCG injection. So, for example, the Cancer Institute in the United States says that BCG use as an immunotherapy to treat bladder cancer. BCG is given in a solution that is placed directly into the bladder, directly using a catheter. Now, this lowers the chance of the cancer coming back. And BCG is also used for reducing childhood leukemia if it is used early enough in children. Doesn't mean it cures leukemia, but reduces the incidence for sure. We have clear evidence for that. We also have long-term effect against lung cancer. And more recently, it has been found that direct injection of BCG in a melanoma infected body part, especially in certain body parts, is very, very effective as an immunotherapy. It's the same way as the bladder cancer. For inoperable stage 3 in transit melanoma, that is godsend for many, many people. So the question arises, why is BCG so special in the first place? Recall that the vaccine is given to newborns and young infants. These kids get bacterial infection and other kinds of viral infections at a very early age, and this is what BCG vaccine gives a protection against. It is made out of a live weakened germ itself and then given it to the children. So there is some unique mechanism for giving the protection. How exactly does that the immune system gets that is not all that clear, but one thing we do know is that newborns and very young infants have a very different immune system than what the adults do. And somewhere along the way, it does the magic. Many researchers have noticed that there seems to have been a protective barrier produced, especially among healthcare workers when they're given the BCG vaccine, and they seem to have protected them to some extent from certain kinds of COVID. So a control trial was ordered and implemented in 2011, where in Europe they introduced 3,000 people above 60 with comorbidity. Half of them got placebo, half of them got BCG, and to figure out over the period of next 1 year if there is a difference in terms of COVID incidence between these two groups of people. Recall that half of the people who got placebo did not know whether they got the placebo or not. So that's how it's the randomized trial which made it possible so that people didn't know. In other words, in order to prevent them from taking more risks and so on. What did they find? They found that there is absolutely no difference in terms of their protection against COVID by taking BCG. Does that mean that there is no effect of BCG at all on COVID? That's not what it says. Recall that these are people who are already 60 years old or more with comorbidities, and therefore whatever the result was found there is not necessarily reflected if the BCG that we give to the newborns and the young infants have any effect or not. In fact, they do. So the secret of BCG itself was discovered by the Swedish doctor back in 1931, what we today call trained immunity. What exactly is trained immunity? It is a biological process. It gives an innate stimuli to the body. It induces epigenetic and metabolic reprogramming, and it results in an induction of trained immunity of the body itself. And that's what BCG is. Recently, there was a big appeal to the international medical community to use BCG for trained immunity against other kinds of diseases that are surely be coming down the pipeline. And we will look at exactly how it is supposed to work. What we know about BCG is that once it is given, in particular to the newborns and to the young children, it makes its way to the bone marrow. And bone marrow has a special place for the BCG vaccine. And it seems to mix up with other kinds of chemicals or cells that are present, which eventually makes its way into the bloodstream and thereby producing these trained fighters that eventually fights again, not just against tuberculosis, but a whole host of other diseases. So BCG is given as young children, which makes its way to the bone marrow, and then it gets circulated in the blood. That's the phase 1 of this new initiative that are being proposed. The second phase that has been proposed, which was not there until now, was to give an adult booster to the BCG that people have already received. And that could actually go through the IL-1 beta, IL-6, and TNF alpha cells, which are all cells inside the body that fights invaders into the body through microbes, basically through other kinds of diseases that try to invade into the blood system. There has been a number of studies looking at if the vaccine of BCG is actually effective against any kind of COVID, because recall that there are several different kinds of COVIDs that have been floating around, and there has been some evidence that in observational studies, at least half of the cases where we do see effect against COVID virus. In clinical studies as well, we also see some effect of this vaccine on the COVID itself. We do study these observational cases where we observe a group of people who had one kind of condition, another group of had another kind of condition, and to see if we can make any comparison to see if there is a difference coming from something else, in this case the BCG vaccine itself, whether it is doing something against the COVID virus. Now, it is always hard to get two groups of people with all kinds of things matching up and trying to tease out the effect of whether this is because of this particular thing or something else altogether that we are not controlling. One evidence to me that came out very, very clearly was when there was a study done between Eastern and Western Germany. Recall that not that long ago, just over 30 years ago, East Germany was a separate country. And in that era of the separate nation, they had quite different policies on how to deal with the BCG vaccine. In the East German part, over a period of 25 years, there was a strict regime of vaccine, BCG vaccine given to all children. Whereas in Western Germany, or West Germany at that time, that was not the case. Namely, they were given, but it was not mandatory. In East Germany, you couldn't get into a school without having to prove that you have given your children the vaccine. So when you compare the results of what happened to the mortality during a particular phase of COVID, the results are quite clear. The incidence per 1,000, that's the left picture. The lower is the rate for East Germany. Exactly the same thing happens with mortality, and they're quite significant. Now, because there's a lot of mixture going on, that is people moving from now, since the coming down of the Berlin Wall, people have moved from east to west and west to east and so on. So the population is kind of mixed up over the last 30 years. Even then, we see this persistent difference in what happened with COVID, and a lot of people believed, including myself, that this was a direct effect of the BCG vaccine.